Our planet Earth is made up of a multitude of complex ecosystems, each unique but dependent on the others. Disrupt one, and the equilibrium that holds this complex system together crumbles into a landslide that ultimately disrupts them all. It is clear that we have now reached that critical point and have entered into a serious biodiversity deficit, a crisis for which we humans are wholly responsible. Despite indisputable evidence of this, we still continue to indiscriminately damage our own habitat and that of every species with which we share our living planet. So where, then, do we go from here? And who, among the minority that hold the world's power, is really listening to the warnings being voiced by our delicate environment? We are at a turning point of profound importance. But how do we meet this challenge? We need change implemented from the highest level. We need our governments to put climate action at the top of the agenda, with effective changes put in place not in the future, but from today onwards. How do we, you and I, help to bring the relationship with our fragile world back into balance? What are we already doing? What changes do we really want to see happen? And what do we really feel here, in the shared environment?
Well, it's just horrible that they have plastic in the ocean. Fish get trapped in it, animals get killed in it, turtles, fish, birds, all those kind of animals just getting killed.
All the plastics in the sea really do upset me because there's many animals in the sea where it's very upsetting to see them die because of our cause, and there's many things that are becoming endangered because of it. For example, sea turtles, they're eating stuff that they shouldn't be when they don't realise, and we're killing innocent, beautiful creatures, and it's wrong.
Climate change to me is absolutely terrifying. The fact that people aren't opening their eyes to what is actually happening in this planet right now is really scary. So many people are just oblivious to it, and this plastic stuff is ridiculous. How is it not legal yet? I just don't understand that. It doesn't go away.
It's like we're aliens and we landed and destroyed the Earth. It's like that.
The world is just backwards right now, and it shouldn't be. We're destroying it, and you're meant to leave no impact. It's like leave no trace.
Over 2/3 of our blue planet is covered in water. Oceans, which were once teeming with life, are now being depleted of marine species at an unprecedented rate. The significance of the degradation of these species is clearly not being well considered, as currently only around 4% of the oceans are designated as marine protected areas, whilst only a minuscule number of these areas are fully protected from overfishing and other damaging activities. These zones and future areas of marine conservation need to be elevated to the status of highly protected to ensure each habitat's complete restoration.
After my doctorate, I worked for the Antarctic Survey, working on glaciers and climate change issues in Antarctica. And I did the same sort of work in Greenland and Iceland as well. Our sense was that the climate glacier system was really relatively stable, and that it would take quite a lot to shift it out of that stability. In the 60s, it was being predicted by quite a lot of people that the world's climate was going to cool. And now if we look at the situation today, everything has been flipped. Everything is upside down, and it's absolutely obvious now, all the science is pointing in the same direction, that we're in a catastrophic warming instead of a catastrophic cooling. And that has to be the result of human interference, because the natural cycle has been completely disrupted.
You know, we are punching way, way, way above our space in the ecological, spectrum, if you like. There's just too many of us, and we're living in a too heavy-footed kind of a way at the moment to not have an impact on everything else.
I feel quite sad, very sad. I feel angry, and I also feel helpless when it comes to climate change and the implications of not doing anything right now for when, say, I'm 60, 70 odd, and I've got my own kids, maybe even grandkids. What kind of world is it going to be for them where, they go outside and might have to wear masks because of the pollution, or you've got to stay inside in summer because the temperature is through the roof, or, you look at Bangladesh. I think the way we're going right now with sea levels rising, Bangladesh is going to be underwater. Most of it is going to be underwater in the next 50 years. Millions of people live there, and they're too poor to relocate. It's not like the government can afford it either, because they're not a wealthy nation. So I just think it's awful, because all of those people are going to lose their homes. It just makes me so sad that big corporations and governments just seem to ignore the issue completely.
Nobody has ever done proper cost balance calculations, I think, on the use of fossil fuels and the cost of burning fuels willy-nilly without any thought of the consequences, because the consequences have never properly been paid for in the equation. We've always left that part of the equation out of our thinking altogether, almost as if you can have all of the benefits without any of the costs. And suddenly now the world has realised that there is a major cost that has already been accumulated. That cost is now almost so big that we may never even be able to pay it back, as it were, or to bring the calculation back into a state of equilibrium. So I think it's a very dangerous time that we're living in, and it is going to need enormously powerful and decisive action on the part of the international community, I think, to get things sorted.
I think one of the biggest changes I'd like to see is big corporations being financially forced into changing their ways so that they're more green, they're more, environmentally friendly, and their greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, or at least carbon neutral. They should be financially penalised if they don't show willingness to change how their business operates. Another massive thing that I would really like to see is governments this time making sure that they start, they make a complete change and they just go all in for renewable and sustainable energy. I think that would really also complement the incentivization of electrical cars. Because if you get an electric car and making it isn't environmentally more damaging than actually using it, if you can then actually charge that up from energy that's been taken, from the sun or from the air, that's amazing, because that's not impacting the planet in a negative way.
Fossil fuel use, we all know the consequences of that. I've always felt that we've been conned on nuclear power as well. There are still people who think that nuclear power stations are wonderful because they are carbon neutral. Well, they're not carbon neutral. That's a complete myth that's been spread by the nuclear power industry with the help of quite a lot of rather irresponsible politicians. There is so much energy embedded in a nuclear power station that it'll probably take between 10 and 20 years of successful operation to pay back the energy that's gone into building it. It's carbon neutral when it's running, that's for sure, but you've got to build the wretched thing to start with.
We live in interesting times, really. The climate is changing, it's unpredictable, the seasons are different. Like this year we've got hardly any fruit because I'm not entirely sure why. There was blossom, it was quite warm at the time, there was blossom and should have all been pollinated, but there's hardly any apples on the trees.
This is where I was born, and this is where I grew up as a farmer, been farming for over 50 years. We turned organic about nearly 30 years ago, and it's a sustainable farm. By sustainable, I mean we don't buy any animal feedstuffs in. We don't use any pesticides, any chemicals, any artificial fertilizer. At this moment, I'm sitting in a crop of Emmer wheat, and this seed is a heritage variety of wheat dating back to the Egyptians. These are the kind of food grown locally that are going to sustain the human race. We must change our way of thinking to sourcing our food locally and creating community farms so that we can have control of our food instead of depending it in mass production from supermarkets.
We're growing organically and using biodynamic principles. We haven't gone down the certification route because we've got a close contact with all our members, so they understand how we produce. We're growing on 7 acres, and on those 7 acres we produce for 120 households, and we've now got 70 more households on a waiting list. We work with schools, primary schools, educating about sustainable farming. We host trainees. We generally just get involved in the whole sustainable growing network as far as we can across Wales. We've got enough good quality land in and around Swansea and South Wales that there's no reason actually why we couldn't produce all of our own food. Availability of land and availability of skills are the only things that would stop that happening. So I guess, in the future that could be possible.
In my lifetime, I never thought I'd see Monsanto being the guilty party and truth prevailing and Monsanto brought to justice. This is because they created a chemical called Roundup. Roundup is widespread, used all over the world as a pesticide for killing plants, all green plants. It's used in 80% of GM crops. This chemical has, part of it is made up of glyphosate. Glyphosate is one of the main causes of cancer. There's been 3 cases where Monsanto was found guilty of poisoning people and creating cancer in their bodies.
It is completely insane in this country that Roundup, for example, one of the most lethal chemicals ever invented, is still available in supermarkets and garden centres. It was sold originally as the ultimate killing machine, and people seem to think that that's no problem, you know. If there's a weed on our garden path, quick, get out the Roundup and zap it, you know. And so you get reductions in the biological activity in the soil horizon that works its way through to the food chain. Birds are affected because their foods are not there, and it works right the way through the ecosystem eventually. So it's about time we started to think about that sort of issue, and certainly I think if Wales can take a lead with new projects and with a determined political stance on the use of chemicals in the environment, then more power to their elbow. So what are you been up to?
I feel very passionate about bringing organic, natural food to the community, because it's a lot better to know where your food comes from instead of them being covered in preservatives and pesticides. We grow natural crops, so it's farm to plate, so you know where all of your food is coming from, you can see, and it brings everyone closer together in the community. I hope I can carry on in the footsteps of my dad and my granddad, because I aspire to be like them, helping the planet and Earth instead of using chemicals and spraying all these lovely crops. Bysa fi'n dweud, mae rhaid newid llawer o pethau, fel pethau ni'n dreifo i'r stwff ni'n bita a shwt wyddwn ni'n neud e, achos mae'n newid stwff gormod a sy'n fe'n iawn am y byd.
GM crops are crops that have their DNA altered. They insert a virus into it, antibiotics and other things into the plant which would not normally in a natural environment be contaminated with. A peppermint gene and a synthetic cow gene to make it resistant to aphids. Aphids are not a big problem in this country, but putting such thing as a synthetic cow gene in a plant that ends up in our bread or in our cereals, can you really be serious about this? Another heroic young lady, Rachel Parent in America, who was a teenager who has stood up to fight against GM crops and excessive pesticide and herbicide use in farming, etc. She's another very brave young lady who's been vilified by nasty people who've got nothing much better to do. But she's been another great hero, I think, environmentally. And so as long as there are young people like this around who are prepared to make a stand, at great personal risk very often, because they do get hammered and vilified by horrible people. I think as long as there are people like that, and as long as there are thousands of youngsters prepared to go out on the streets and demonstrate and make their voices heard, that has to be a positive sign.
Though we urgently need a global outlook and global solutions, we clearly also need to keep focus on making the changes in our own lives and within our own environment.
An element of our work is increasing the biodiversity of what we grow, but also the insects, birds, wildlife that comes into the land. Well, that's very noticeable, going from what was just a green field, which was generally cut or grazed, where there's very little diversity, into lots of different crops, and then big sections within those crops where we have this mass diversity of fertility builders. And when particularly when they're at their flowering stage, those areas of the field are just covered in insects. And it's, you kind of wonder where all those insects come from, where, because we're kind of in a sea of green when you see us from above. You wonder what those insects do if they don't have access to areas like that, how they sort of feed and reproduce. Children have gone home and taught their parents into growing vegetables at home. And I've met a kid actually on another project who came and told me all about the garden he'd set up at home after coming and doing a visit here, and he was growing all sorts of stuff in a little plot behind his house.
We decided that we would try and be as self-sufficient as we could be in that space, and we made vegetable beds, we erected a greenhouse, we made a little pond. Everything was tiny. We made a little garden shelter, and we had a green roof on it, so we had veg in the roof as well, and we had window boxes on the little tool shed. On about the 4th or 5th year that we were there, I decided to weigh everything that we took out of the garden for a whole year, fruit and vegetables, and we ended up with 88 kilos of fruit and 109 kilos of vegetables in that year.
Which is a loss of lettuce leaves, French beans, tomatoes.
Yeah,
like some things don't weigh very much, so
no.
that's a kilo of rocket is like a big pile of rocket.
Yeah, and that was actually a lower estimate because Andy didn't weigh everything because he was so annoyed.
He weighed that.
It did feel really manageable, and when we sat down and sort of worked out how long it took us to literally to do everything to get that amount of fruit and veg, it was on average a couple of hours a week.
Climate change solutions come in many forms, mostly natural and very achievable. Habitat restoration on mountains, land and coastal fringes. Every small change representing a massive improvement for that specific ecosystem. Some of these passive carbon sink superstars include peatlands, native trees, rainforests, seagrass beds, and salt marsh. There is so much land that could still be rejuvenated. But first, we must step back from our obsession with taming our planet and allow nature to reassert herself unimpeded.
We're all aware of how humans are encroaching on species and species decline, and yet in our business schools, and we teach thousands of students annually, virtually no one is touching the issue of climate change, species decline, biodiversity, etc. And yet we are educating so many students.
I feel in school we should be certainly taught more about climate change and global warming. It's a huge problem throughout the world and we deserve to know what's going on.
I think it's really sad that a lot of governments, including mine, the UK government, aren't doing enough in terms of climate change. I think it was 2015 at the Paris Accord, I think it was EU countries got together and they set out all of these wonderful, goals to hit in terms of combating climate change. And they were going to do it within so many years and, you're going to hit this goal, that goal. Pathetic, I think is the word. And it feels like they don't care. The government's supposed to be there for the people, but they're not.
The way that they're dealing with everything is just wrong. It's not the way to. I don't understand how they have power over this country. We're in such a rut at the moment, and it's just like no one seems to really care about the environment. we're destroying our planet. It's the time for the world to come together and actually look after each other.
Writing to MPs is futile. It just feels like they don't listen. They're just so preoccupied with other things that, and I think they almost feel like they're living in their own bubble, their own kind of reality. They're completely ignoring what's going on. The deforestation, the greenhouse gas emissions, warming, which is happening every year. They just disregard it because I think it's because it doesn't affect them directly.
The trouble with politicians in their little bubbles is that they don't encounter the consequences of their actions.
I think the governments are particularly ignoring the fact that the world is changing in a bad way, and this is because they're afraid to admit it, that we're the cause of it.
The establishment, in inverted commas, has been acting in a way that is completely irresponsible. Despicable, I think, is a word we can use. They control the global, financial system. Oil industry, the fossil fuel industries are very powerful in there. There are vested interests everywhere. And they seem to be incapable of thinking more than a few years ahead. So, all power to the younger generation. They need to stand up and start shouting and start marching and start demonstrating, because although they've got no effective political power, they do have power in the ballot box. Let's hope that their demonstrations actually do have some effect before it's all too late.
Politicians need to engage the young people because they're the future of their parties anyway. Because 5-10 years down the line, our young people are going to be voting. They're going to be voting soon, and they should be having a say in how things are developed and in terms of party policy, etc. I know that Welsh Government is very proactive with young people and trying to engage them. We had to have a young person's commissioner for the country, and I think that's a statement of intent in terms of how we value young people, and I look forward to how they engage in politics in the future.
I think that Wales is in a very good position to demonstrate to the rest of the world how carbon neutral society could be organised, how a community which is positive on the energy front instead of being energy negative. In other words, you're always using and having to import energy from elsewhere. We could actually provide all the energy we need locally. We've got a relatively small population on quite a big land mass. We've got pretty well perfect conditions for wind energy.
The key thing is that there's so much modern statistical evidence that being able to see green, being able to visit green areas, the natural beauty of the environment is absolutely essential to mental health.
Having access to nature and delivering healthcare within a green space environment is absolutely crucial to true health and well-being. It's at the core of who we are as a species, so that disconnection from nature, I think, contributes to our ill health. So if we can find ways of rebuilding our connection with nature and developing our green spaces around and within our healthcare environments, we're actually supporting our health and well-being much more holistically.
For decades we've been accumulating this very interesting evidence from epidemiologists, all kinds of statistical scientists about the importance of green factors in our lives as adults. The latest branch of research, very, very interesting, of extremely high quality in my judgment, is looking at large samples of children growing up, following essentially the whole Danish population, moving from childhood to adulthood. And the researchers showed that the amount of green space around them, the amount of vegetation around them as children, was highly predictive years later, when they become adults, of their risk of mental ill health.
If I was Prime Minister, my first step would be to just, shut down all nuclear power stations. Have to bring in other types of energy production to compensate for the loss of power that's going onto the grid. But that would be something that could be done fairly quickly and which would send a very powerful political message. And on day 2, I would talk about the complete phasing out of fossil fuel power stations and a major shift over to an electric economy.
A wonderful thing that's happened recently is 886 Dutch citizens, so including students and professors, etc., they actually came together and sued the government in a class action lawsuit because they weren't doing enough to combat climate change. And the judge actually ruled in the favour of the people and ordered the government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I believe, by 25% within the next 5 years or around about then. And I think that's amazing. And I think hopefully it set the ball rolling, because if we can have a similar thing, and if other EU countries can do a similar thing, and other countries around the world can do a similar thing, actually sue the government, force their hand in terms of combating climate change, I think that's going to be a massive step forward.
Our young people will create a world and society which is far more tolerant, equal, sustainable, and will look after the future. I think they'll do a better job than us, if I'm perfectly honest.
To make the world a better place, personally, I would say for everyone to get along so there was no conflict, and for everything to grow naturally again, and pollution and global warming and climate change not be a thing.
I think my message would be, when you look out into the universe, we haven't seen any life anywhere else. We haven't even found microbial life on any other planet we've sent probes to yet. Life, as far as we can tell, is really, really special and unique. And, Earth may be one of the very few paradises, at least in our galaxy, where life can thrive as much as it does. You do have these amazing ecosystems. The whole Earth's symbiotic. It keeps a stable atmosphere, etc. My message is, why would you want to not sustain something so beautiful? Why would you let it go just for short-term profit?